We were playing a Guns N' Roses song while you guys were getting set up. I remember you guys had a whole thing with them, right? James, right? You hated those guys. You went on tour with them, and it was just a nightmare.
They were always late. That's why I hated them.
Was that the reason?
I think they pretty much stood for everything we didn't like. The glam, the L.A., the everything we kind of escaped.
Metallica, the undisputed titans of heavy metal. For over 4 decades, they've dominated the stage, sold more than 163 million albums worldwide, and defined thrash for generations. But here's the twist. Not every band has shared the spotlight with them. Behind the epic tours and legendary performances are stories of refusals, rivalries, and flat-out mismatches. Today, we're breaking down the top 10 bands Metallica refused to tour with, and why. From punk icons to glam giants, and even bitter rivals, some of these reasons will shock you. Stick around, this list is wild. Number 10. Slipknot. Few bands in the modern era embody chaos, intensity, and theatrical aggression quite like Slipknot. Since their self-titled debut in 1999, they've been one of the most explosive live acts in the world. 9 masked members tearing across the stage, pounding on drums, climbing scaffolding, and unleashing songs like Wait and Bleed and Duality. With Metallica being the biggest metal band on the planet, you'd think a joint tour between the two would be a no-brainer. But here's the twist, it's never happened. So why not? The answer comes down to intensity, control, and ego. First, the live show contrast. Slipknot concerts are absolute bedlam. Deliberately chaotic, unpredictable, and designed to overwhelm the senses. Pyro, jumpsuits, masks, and 9 musicians creating a storm of noise and energy. Metallica's shows, while still ferocious, are the opposite. Carefully structured, disciplined, and precise. Their focus is on delivering a tight, professional performance. A tour together could have been a clash in philosophies. Metallica's surgical precision versus Slipknot's raw chaos. Then there's the audience factor. Slipknot's fan base skews younger and thrives on extremity. Mosh pits, walls of death, and nonstop carnage are the norm at their gigs. Metallica's fan base, while still hungry for heavy music, spans generations, from old-school thrashers to parents bringing their kids. Mixing those audiences could have been combustible, with one side demanding intensity and the other expecting legacy-driven anthems like Nothing Else Matters. There is the issue of headliner pride, which should not be overlooked. Both bands are headline caliber, Slipknot and Metallica. Neither would accept opening for the other. And that brings up even more tricky issues. Who closes, who gets a longer set, and who really draws the most people. In fact, for Metallica, great protectors of their #1 status, the thought of sharing that spotlight with Slipknot was simply too risky. It shouldn't be noted that there are bad vibes here. In fact, Slipknot frontman Corey Taylor has lauded Metallica several times as one of his biggest influences. But even Taylor once admitted in an interview in 2019 that both bands are worlds apart when it comes to their approach to performing live. The Metallica-Slipknot tour would remain as one of the greatest what-ifs in modern metal. No doubt, it would have been epic, mildly throwing huge tempers around the place. But one decision Metallica made was to tour with safer acts, Pantera or Five Finger Death Punch, as far from untouchable sludge terror that just couldn't provide the band with anything it truly wanted. Metallica would have taken crazy risks under acceptance. Thus, the so-called dream never made it past the drawing board. If you think that was wild, just wait until you see who's up next. Number 9. Creed. Now, say what you will about them, but Creed were huge at their peak. Their album Human Clay sold over 20 million copies worldwide, with radio-dominating hits like Higher and With Arms Wide Open. By the time their follow-up Weather came out, they were headlining arenas and festivals, cementing themselves as one of the biggest bands in America. So why did Metallica ever hit the road with Creed? It really boils down to musical philosophy, image, and audience mismatch. Let's start with the music itself. Creed leaned heavily into soaring, emotional ballads, spiritual undertones, and Scott Stapp's dramatic vocal delivery. Their songs were often interpreted as Christian-leaning anthems, even though the band wasn't officially marketed that way. Metallica, on the other hand, built its legacy on aggression, introspection, and a darker worldview. Pairing, punk, or a half-cherishing crowd and half-mobbing crowd. Either way, what an interesting what-if from the golden age of 90s rock. Number 7. Limp Bizkit, love them or hate them, you can't deny they were massive at their peak. With Fred Durst swaggering around in his red Yankees cap and tracksuits, the band helped define the nu metal explosion alongside Korn, Linkin Park, and Slipknot. Songs like Break Stuff, Rollin', and Nookie weren't just hits. They became anthems for a whole generation of angry teens. So here's the big question. Why did Metallica, one of the world's biggest live draws, ever hit the road with Limp Bizkit during that nu metal boom? After all, both bands were dominating MTV, radio, and festival lineups. On paper, you'd think the crossover could have been huge. The answer boils down to 3 main factors: image, fans, and reliability. First up, image. Metallica's brand has always been built around grit, musicianship, and authenticity. Even when they experimented with mainstream sounds on Load and Reload, there was still an aura of seriousness about them. Limp Bizkit, meanwhile, leaned into theatrics, attitude, and a frat boy aesthetic that screamed spectacle over substance. In a 2003 interview, James Hetfield spoke critically about some nu metal acts, saying they were more about shock value than artistry. While he didn't name Limp Bizkit directly, it wasn't hard to connect the dots. Then there is the fan base issue. Metallica's audience is fiercely dedicated and defiant, preferring their own heavy metal sound over the rap rock crossover screams of Limp Bizkit's audiences. More importantly, in the Saint Anger years, Metallica were undergoing so much backlash from the public. They'd be rolling the dice and hoping not to alienate hardcore fans with an appearance on the same bill as Limp Bizkit. I can only imagine how the people who like hardcore thrashing would feel standing in the pit, just forced to listen to Rollin'. No way. And last, it was that part about reliability. After all, Limp Bizkit, in the aftermath of Woodstock 99, became synonymous with chaos. Their legacy is one having elements suggesting riots and violence. And as a result, promoters and bands alike began to squirm at being put alongside them. Metallica, fresh from the impressive but most ambitious S&M symphony project, wouldn't take a risk on tarnishing their reputation over a shared bill with a media-speaking, reckless group. A Limp Bizkit Metallica pairing could have been one, but never happened. Honestly, good probably. Metallica is trying now to really put themselves back together, whereas Fred Durst and company just lean further toward nu metal notoriety. Different worlds, different paths, and Metallica is not clearly interested in the baggage. Number 6. Nickelback now. Let's be clear, Nickelback were absolutely massive in the early 2000s. Their album Silver Side Up dropped in 2001, and suddenly How You Remind Me was playing everywhere. Radio, MTV, jukeboxes at bars. You couldn't escape it. Nickelback became one of the most commercially successful rock bands of the decade. So if they were that big, why did Metallica ever bring them along for a tour? The answer is all about image, credibility, and fan expectations. For starters, Metallica has always seen itself as the people's band. Even at their most experimental, they've positioned themselves as authentic, uncompromising, and rooted in the raw energy of metal. Nickelback, on the other hand, developed a reputation, fairly or unfairly, as corporate rock. Their sound was polished, radio-friendly, and designed for mass appeal. To hardcore metal fans, Nickelback represented everything Metallica had fought against in their early years. Pairing up with them would have sent the exact wrong message. For one, timing was everything. Early in the 2000s, Metallica were already under fire for the Saint Anger album. Many of the fans are debating over its raw, unpolished production, the absence of guitar solos, and its aggressive tone. The critics are not kind either. Metallica didn't want more ammunition from their haters. Thus, teaming with a band like Nickelback would most probably be seen as the ultimate sellout move. Imagine the headlines: Metallica goes soft with Nickelback. Definitely not a good one. There's also a difference in the live show. Metallica comes heavy with its concerts, circle pits, head banging, and pure catharsis. Nickelback, on the other hand, had an impressive draw for its concerts, circle sing-alongs, and mainstream rock anthems. It's not like Nickelback wouldn't put on a really great show. They just absolutely would. Just a totally different vibe. Combining those crowds would be awkward at best and disastrous at worst. Admit it, it is also culture. Nickelback has been under the joke slate ever since band whom everybody mocks while secretly knowing all his lyrics. Metallica didn't want this language near any of their brand. They were rebuilding legacy and credibility, not throwing it to the winds for punchlines. So, while the Metallica-Nickelback combination should have pulled crowds and thousands back in the early 2000s, it then just did not appeal to Metallica's identity. Such a group would only be sacrificing its legacy, keeping its fan loyal, and avoiding ridicule that could have ensued. Sometimes, the smartest move is the one you do not make. Keep your jaw from dropping, because the next story takes things up a notch. Number 5. Korn. When Korn burst onto the scene in the mid-1990s with their self-titled debut and later albums like Follow the Leader and Issues, they practically invented a whole new wave of heavy music. Their down-tuned guitars, gut-wrenching lyrics, and Jonathan Davis's raw vocal style carved out a darker, angst-ridden corner of rock that connected with millions of fans. By the late 90s, Korn weren't just a band, they were a movement. So, why did Metallica, who were also titans of heavy music, ever hit the road with them? After all, both bands were festival headliners, both dominated MTV, and both commanded rabid fan bases. The reasons boiled down to image, sound, and fan culture. First, the sound mismatch. Korn's music was slower, groove-heavy, and intentionally unsettling. Their live shows were visceral, almost haunting, with Jonathan Davis often delivering anguished performances that felt like therapy on stage. Metallica, on the other hand, thrived on precision, speed, and thrash-driven intensity. While both bands were undeniably heavy, their styles didn't complement each other in a way that screamed perfect tour package. Kirk Hammett once mentioned in a 1999 interview that Metallica preferred to tour with bands that matched their live energy. Korn's dark, brooding vibe just didn't fit that bill. Then there's an image. Korn were literally the poster children for nu metal, a genre that polarized fans and critics alike. Baggy clothes, Adidas tracksuits, and tortured lyrics. Korn played to the angst of a younger generation, the malcontent generation. Of course, Metallica had already faced a lot of backlash during their Load and Reload years, with some accusing them of softening their image. Metallica needed this like they needed to be mixed up with a genre that most traditional metalheads considered a fad. By siding with Korn, Metallica would be, in essence, building that narrative. And, last, the division of fan culture. Korn reached their young audience raw and very much late 90s youth culture oriented. Metallica's reach is equally broad. Parents with kids filling the stadiums, all tied together with decades of thrash history. Mixing the two audiences might have been far more friction than synergy. This was not wrestling with the idea of Metallica possibly disliking Korn. After all, they shared festival bills such as Woodstock '99. But a full wide tour together? That was a different story. Metallica chose to surround themselves instead with bands who would be reminders of their thrash legacy. Pantera, Slayer, or anybody else later, such as Avenged Sevenfold. Considering Korn had reinvented heavy music for today's generation, Metallica held them at bay when it came down to touring. Number 4. Kiss. Known for their elaborate costumes, face paint, pyrotechnics, and larger-than-life stage shows, Kiss built a legacy on turning rock concerts into full-blown theatrical productions. They were, and still are, masters of showmanship. But when it comes to Metallica, there's a reason these two iconic bands never joined forces for a tour. It comes down to ethos, image, and fan culture. From the very beginning, Metallica positioned themselves as the antithesis of glam. In the early 80s, when glam metal bands like Motley Crue and Poison were dominating MTV with flashy outfits and radio-friendly hooks, Metallica doubled down on aggression and authenticity. They wore jeans and t-shirts, rejected makeup and theatrics, and insisted that the music, not the spectacle, should do the talking. Lars Ulrich once slammed glam metal in an 80s interview, calling it fake and shallow. While he didn't specifically name Kiss, the subtext was clear. Metallica wanted no part of that world. By the time the 90s rolled around, Kiss was still selling out arenas, while Metallica had ascended to stadium-level dominance. Both bands were massive, but their styles couldn't have been more different. Kiss shows were about fireworks, blood spitting, and Gene Simmons breathing fire. Metallica's shows were about raw power, tight musicianship, and almost blue-collar sense of grit. Pairing them together would have created a bizarre clash of aesthetics. Over-the-top glam spectacle versus stripped-down thrash ferocity. That is not the only fan factor, because Metallica fans have always been this fiercely defensive about their band's credibility. Imagine the fans of hardcore thrash seeing their idols touring with Kiss and considering that a betrayal. Glam was, after all, the enemy back in the 80s. On the other hand, Kiss fans rush in for sheer camp value and anthems like Rock and Roll All Night. How would a brief sampling of Creeping Death or Battery fit into that? There are other factors we'll not discuss about the logistics. Kiss has this pretty ornate stage production, enormous pieces, effects, and moving platforms. Metallica is not minimalistic, yet likes a cleaner, simpler stage design. Joining these two would be a logistical nightmare. One setup might easily overshadow the other. Number 3. Megadeth. If there's one band you'd think Metallica would tour with, given their shared thrash roots, it would be Dave Mustaine's Megadeth. But outside of a handful of one-off festivals like the Big Four shows, a proper full-scale tour has never happened. And the reason is simple: bad blood, rivalry, and pride. Let's rewind. Back in 1983, Dave Mustaine was Metallica's lead guitarist. He was fiery, aggressive, and a brilliant player, but he was also battling substance abuse and clashing constantly with the rest of the band. James Hetfield and Lars Ulrich eventually decided they couldn't handle the volatility anymore and famously fired him just before recording their debut album, Kill 'Em All. Mustaine was devastated. He vowed revenge, formed Megadeth, and spent years determined to outdo his former bandmates. And for a long time, that rivalry fueled both groups. Metallica went on to become the biggest metal band in history, while Megadeth built their own massive following, especially in the thrash scene, with landmark albums like Peace Sells, But Who's Buying? And Rust in Peace. The feud became one of metal's most famous grudges, with Mustaine often taking shots at Metallica in interviews. The festivals and concert events that had included performances from both camps were more or less few and far between. Such cases fall under the Big Four concerts of 2010 to 2011, where Slayer and Anthrax shared the stage with both camps. All this was possible, but a joint tour was never an option for the two groups. What's more, because old wounds never heal. Just as recently as in 2020, Mustaine has, in interviews, pronounced that he still carries a grudge about how he was tossed out. Hetfield, while respectful, has made it known that keeping distance prevents unnecessary drama. There is also the fact of competition. Both bands are titans of thrash, and comparison is inevitable if they were put in front of a larger crowd. Who would deliver the tighter set? Who would earn the louder cheers? Metallica never seemed to welcome the possibility of providing Megadeth with a venue that could potentially reignite old rivalries due to their protective nature. The Mega Tour was, of course, a dream for fans. Imagine hearing Master of Puppets and Holy Wars on the same night. But for Metallica, the possible baggage outweighed the dream. The Big Four shows gave fans a taste of unity, but given the long history and underlying tension that exists between these two bands, a full tour is unlikely. It's one rivalry that never quite left the stage. Number 2. Linkin Park. With the release of Hybrid Theory in 2000 and Meteora in 2003, Linkin Park became one of the biggest bands on the planet. Their mix of heavy guitar riffs, electronic textures, and rap rock vocals from Mike Shinoda and Chester Bennington struck a chord with millions. They weren't just topping charts. They were shaping the sound of mainstream rock in the early 2000s. So why didn't Metallica, who were still one of the biggest touring acts in the world, ever share a tour with Linkin Park? After all, both bands were stadium ready, both had devoted fan bases, and both carried massive cultural weight. The answer? It comes down to genre, timing, and logistics. First, the genre divide. Linkin Park's sound was groundbreaking, but it leaned heavily into rap, electronic beats, and emotional lyrics about alienation and pain. It was a hybrid style, no pun intended, that resonated with younger listeners raised on MTV and video games. Metallica, by contrast, were on a mission to reassert their thrash roots after the backlash of Saint Anger. Their focus was on raw riffs, heavy metal authenticity, and reclaiming credibility with longtime fans. Pairing with a band like Linkin Park, no matter how successful, risked signaling that Metallica was buying into the nu metal wave they had quietly distanced themselves from. The second issue was timing. By the early to mid-2000s, both bands were stars in their own right. Linkin Park was selling arena shows out, running their own Project Revolution festivals, and getting top-billing slots at the biggest events. Metallica was still packing stadiums all over the world. A joint tour was therefore set to raise the sticky question of who opens, who closes, and who gives ground. The degree to which any band would compromise with the other was highly unlikely. And lastly, the audience was a factor. Metallica's audience required mosh pits, headbanging, and aggression. Linkin Park's audience was catered more to emotional outpouring, sing-alongs, and very eclectic and experimental approaches to different genres. There were, of course, some intersections, but in essence, the experience offered to both audiences was vastly different. Metallica Linkin Park could probably have left both audiences feeling a tad cheated. Not that there was animosity, though. Quite the contrary. Chester Bennington said something like, "Furthermore, regarding Metallica," and even made a tribute cover of its songs. The respect was there, just not for each other, for touring. So big a crossover tour linking Metallica with Linkin Park could have been, but it never happened. Different sounds, different paths, and the two empires elected to reign separately. In retrospect, the lack of a collaborative tour involving Metallica and Linkin Park might have been a blessing in disguise for both bands to preserve their uniqueness. Linkin Park ruled the roost through the early 2000s in every sense with their ever-evolving blend of music, and in turn, Metallica seemed to revalidate its legacy of thrash. Fans were spared from the awkwardness of an unharmonious engagement, while both these bands were left free to build their own empires without compromising. Don't catch your breath just yet, because last but not least, this band takes the drama even higher. Number 1. Guns N' Roses. Technically, Metallica did tour with Guns N' Roses in 1992, the infamous joint stadium tour. But that experience went so disastrously wrong that Metallica has never attempted it again. Let's break down why. The idea at the time was brilliant. Two of the biggest rock bands in the world are joining forces for a megatour. Metallica were riding high off the Black Album, selling out stadiums across the globe. Guns N' Roses were still massive with Use Your Illusion 1 and 2, and Axl Rose was one of the most notorious frontmen in rock. On paper, this was the ultimate hard rock/metal double bill. But in practice, it was chaos. The tour was plagued with problems from the very beginning. The most infamous incident came in Montreal. During Metallica's set, James Hetfield accidentally walked into a misfired pyrotechnic and suffered severe burns on his arm and face. The band had to cut their performance short. Fans were justifiably upset, but things only got worse when Guns N' Roses appeared hours later on stage. Axl Rose showed up late, performed a short set, and walked off due to vocal problems. The audience, angry over getting half a concert from both bands, went berserk and rioted, property was destroyed, and the police called in. The Montreal show went down as one of the biggest disasters in rock. And this wasn't the only instance. Throughout the tour, late shows, and sometimes late cancellations, were a constant source of friction for Axl Rose. Metallica, traditionally much more disciplined, grew increasingly agitated with Rose's antics. Ulrich then characterized the tour as frustrating and hinted that Guns N' Roses were simply too unreliable as far as touring partners were concerned. Musically, matches were indeed pretty well made. Enter Sandman and Sweet Child O' Mine could have gone back-to-back as crowd pleasers. But professionalism and reliability clashed, and it became a nightmare. Metallica is valued for the neatness and structure of their performances. Guns N' Roses at that time maintained unpredictability in their performances and sometimes outright chaos. Except for a brief tour together, another tour would not have happened since 1992. One ugly chapter was enough. One point was clearly made to Metallica. With a touring partner, reliability counts just as much as star power. The joint tour was made legendary, however, not for the reasons that were anticipated. And so, Metallica vowed that it would never again be a part of that circus. That disastrous run in the 80s has cast a long shadow over Metallica's future decisions. After witnessing high-profile partnerships gone horribly wrong, they drew the line between who otherwise would share the stage with them. Trust, punctuality, and professionalism became the non-negotiable values in selecting tour mates. The tale of Guns N' Roses was the warning most promising sales had a more important value for Metallica than risking themselves in another headline-grabbing partnership. To keep their reputation intact and provide fans the show that is expected. And that's the list, the top 10 bands Metallica refused to tour with and why. From creative clashes to full-on chaos, each decision helped cement their place as the kings of metal. Now it's your turn. Which band on this list shocked you most? And what dream tour do you wish had happened? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more metal deep dives. And check out the next video.